Hi, everyone. Welcome once again to the Symposium on Global Food Policy and Food Security. It's our second academic year for this activity, and it's now being hosted and sponsored by the Center for Food Security and Environment. We have now elevated to a center, which we're very happy about. And this year we have a fantastic lineup for the Symposium series, and we'll be running the series basically every month through June. So we hope that we will have all of you in the audience throughout the year. And just to remind you and those of you who haven't been to the Symposium series before, the idea of this series, which is funded generously by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is to provide a curriculum on food policy and food security, not only for you here at Stanford and for the Gates Foundation staff, Prabhu, but also for other universities around the United States and abroad, and particularly for the master's and other graduate programs that the Gates Foundation is funding and supporting in sub-Saharan Africa. And the series that we are showing you today and throughout the year is going to be broadcast online and available to these programs in Africa and other parts of the world. There'll be a volume on the series that will be a volume on food policy, really with new thinking on food policy that will be available free of charge to people in the developing world. So we're really very happy and very grateful to the Gates Foundation for supporting this effort and for giving the opportunity to extend our knowledge throughout the world. It's our first extensive learning, external learning and teaching program that we've had here. So today we have a great lineup. We have two speakers that are going to talk about agricultural technology and productivity increases in agriculture. And let me introduce them quickly and not spend too much time giving too much background on the program. The first speaker is Prabhu Pingali, who actually comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Prabhu is born, he was born in a very small village of India. This village, Hyderabad, I think, right, is now like a megacity. And so it's just amazing how much has changed over the decades. And so Prabhu's perspective coming from India, but then working globally, is very interesting. Prabhu graduated in PhD from North Carolina State and then launched into a very international career. He spent 5 years at the World Bank, 9 years at the International Race Research Institute. That's where I first met him. Then he went to CIMMYT, the Center for Maize and Wheat Improvement in Mexico, and spent 6 years. Went on to lead the economics program at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations for 6 years. He must be really old, but you'll see, he doesn't actually look as old as he sounds. And then for the past 4 years, he's actually been at the Gates Foundation, and he's a deputy director for agricultural development and holds the policy and data portfolio there. So we have known Prabhu through all of these different parts of his life, and I don't think the Gates could have found a better person actually to lead their policy program, because he has a wealth of experience. In fact, he's written 10 books and at least 100 articles, and what to us is really impressive is that he has books on all three major developing country continents, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So he really has a very wide experience. He also has a number of accolades. He is a foreign associate of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Association of Agricultural Economics. He is a past president of the International Ag Econ Association. And as you'll see, he's just incredibly knowledgeable. And Prabhu, we're very happy to have you here today. So let me introduce our second speaker and then let the two speakers take up the floor. Our second speaker is Phil Pardey, who will become obvious to you in a moment, was born in Australia. He doesn't hide that fact very well when he starts speaking, actually. He's a PhD in Ag Econ from the University of Minnesota, and then also went on to have a very distinguished international career. He spent a number of years within the consultative group on international agricultural research, first at ISNAR, which is the arm that represents national agricultural research programs, and then went on to the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. He then went back to Minnesota. He's been at Minnesota for the past decade, and he runs a program on science, technology, and policy, and he can tell you a little bit more about that. In fact, the program, I think, is called the International Science and Technology Practice and Policy Program. And Phil is particularly known in the areas of intellectual property, agricultural research and development, and productivity increases. And if there's one person that you really want to talk to, and we always use his work in our class, somebody who really understands what are the trends in productivity and investments in technology around the world, Phil is definitely the person for that, and also for projecting where the best investments should be made in the future. He also has a number of accolades. He's a distinguished fellow and past president of the Australian Agricultural Association, Economics Association. And I would say the Australian, for those of you who don't know, the Australian Ag Econ Association is one of the best in the world. And so, you know, that even though you're down under, really you do shine in so many ways. Also a fellow of the American Agricultural Economics Association, and comes to us again with a wealth of knowledge. So I want to welcome both Prabhu and Phil, and thank all of you for coming. We look forward to a great agenda today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Roz, thank you very much for a very kind introduction. Wally, great to see you again. Let me start off by making one small correction. I actually was born in a tiny little village on the east coast of India. It was a rice-growing village, still is a rice-growing village. My father was a rice farmer. He just stopped farming recently. The Green Revolution came to our village in 1967, when a tiny little plot was planted with IR8, the high-yielding rice variety. And I remember the entire village walking by to see this trial that was going on. And the following year, the entire village used IR8, the high-yielding rice variety. That transformed our village. That paid for my schooling. That paid for my college. I think of myself as being here today because of what the Green Revolution did to my family and my village. And that's something I'm really proud of. Let me start by taking you back to the 1950s, 1960s. Many of you were not born at that time. 1950s, 1960s was a time when people around the world were really concerned about what was happening in Asia. They were concerned about very high population growth rates, very low food supplies, massive food deficits, high levels of hunger, and risk of famines. That was Asia. And many places around the world, including this campus, there were people seriously talking about triage. How do you create a situation where we have to sacrifice millions so millions others can survive in this world? That was a time when the Club of Rome put out a report called The Limits to Growth, in which it talked about the fact that there were definite boundaries to the materials that the earth possesses, and that there is no way that we can expand beyond them, and that we were going to run out of food and all other mineral resources. But the Green Revolution proved everybody wrong. The Green Revolution proved that innovation, technological change, and just plain old human ingenuity can surpass many of these constraints, physical constraints. The Green Revolution proved that even in very densely populated countries, you can grow enough food to feed the populations. And that's been a dramatic lesson that's come out of the Green Revolution. And it's something that I don't believe we spend enough time celebrating. And that's one thing I'm going to do today. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time in the celebration, but also talk about some of the issues, the concerns, and the way forward. I think one thing is very, very clear when you think about the Green Revolution. Think about where we were in the 1960s and think about where we are today. We've seen a doubling of overall food production. We've seen the rate of growth in food production to be greater than population growth rates, significantly greater than population growth rates. And we've seen all of that happening not by increasing the land area under cultivation. It's happened through increases in yields, increases in productivity, and improvements in total factor productivity. That's the talk that Pardey is going to give after this, so you'll hear a lot more details on that. But it's these changes that came about through technological change that resulted in productivity improvement and increases in food supply that resulted in the Green Revolution. The second thing that happened was because of that increases in productivity, we've seen a period of long-term decline in food prices. Food prices, yes, today are turning around, and there's a whole story around that that we'll get into. But if you think about it, between about 1975 and 2005, we've had an extended period of declining food prices in real terms. And this has been good news for consumers. This has been good news for urban consumers, especially the poor urban consumers. And it's been good news for the poor rural consumers. Even small farmers, because very small farmers tend to be net purchasers of food. And because of that, having food at low prices has really benefited them and helped them move out of poverty. People ask me, if you're a farmer, then aren't low prices bad for you? Well, one of the less well-known facts about the Green Revolution is that the cost per ton of production fell faster than prices fell. So even as prices were falling, farmers were able to maintain their profitability over the long term. And that's been a dramatic change that took place over time. There have been several people, several institutions that over the last few decades have said, what would have happened if the Green Revolution did not take place? And the counterfactuals are really hard to figure out. But there's some credible studies. And one of them is the work that was done at IFPRI by Mark Rosegrant and Bob Evanson. And they show that if the Green Revolution hadn't taken place, globally, we would have seen 20% less food production in the year 2000. We'd have seen developing countries import about 30% more food. We'd have seen much lower calorie consumption, about 13, 14% lower, and higher levels of child malnutrition. Now remember, these numbers are global numbers. These numbers are global averages. But think about what the scenario would have been in India, what the scenario would have been in Bangladesh, what the scenario would have been in Indonesia, what the scenario would have been in China. That's where the real changes took place. And the real impact of the Green Revolution has been the changes that took place in these countries. In India, because of the Green Revolution, we saw a dramatic drop in rural poverty, a drop of 20%. At the start of the Green Revolution, rural poverty was close to 60%. It dropped to about 40% by mid-80s. It dropped another 10% over the next 20 years. But as an Indian, I feel we could have done a lot better. I feel that we could have dropped poverty rates even further down and had a much sharper decline. And one of the reasons we did not was the success of the Green Revolution itself created a sense of complacency and we took our eye off the ball in terms of investments in agriculture research, investments in productivity improvement, etc. And so now, today, as we look at 2011, 2012 time period, India has suddenly realized that it needs to get back and significantly increase the investments that it's making in productivity improvement. So one of the changes that we've seen is that smallholder productivity growth that came through the Green Revolution resulted in overall rural growth and rural transformation. So if you go across the developing world, wherever there's been productivity growth taking place, you've seen entire rural communities change. Overall human well-being in these communities has changed through better health, better education, better living standards, etc. And these changes are palpable. All you have to do is go to any of these villages and you'll see it directly. But it's also resulted in overall economic development in many of these economies. In fact, it's very hard for us to find a country that's developed today, a country that's transforming today, which did not start with agriculture as an engine of growth. And what happened in the 60s and 70s reinforces that historic rule that agriculture has been an engine of growth. Now, how did all this begin? Where did this start? It started rather modestly. It started with two international agriculture research centers, the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, the International Maize and Wheat Center in Mexico. I was fortunate to have worked at both of them. And what these two centers did in the 60s, and in the case of Summit, starting in the 50s itself, is to take a backlog of research, backlog of technical know-how that was available, and adapt it to improving the crops that were important to the poor, rice, wheat, and maize, and create modern high-yielding varieties that are responsive to fertilizers, that can increase yields quite dramatically in smallholder agriculture systems. So that was the innovation that took place in these two small international centers. But the way they then created the transformation was the massive investments that took place in capacity building across the developing world, in capacity building for breeding, for agronomy, for agriculture policy, agriculture extension, etc., and then create a network of breeders and network of crop scientists who were able to take this technological innovations that came out of these centers and move them forward across all of the developing countries where it was relevant and where it was appropriate. During these time periods, during the 70s, during the 80s, and even during the 90s, there was no question about IP rights. There was no question about restriction to sharing of germplasm. So you had a global system where there was uninhibited sharing of all the material that was available. And that resulted in the rapid spread that took place. Today, many of these global networks have collapsed or in danger of collapsing, and primarily because there's increasing restriction to the free movement of this type of germplasm. And that's something that, as you look ahead, we need to be thinking about. Sorry, this is a little hard to read. But I think the lesson that we learned from the Green Revolution is that technology is absolutely important, but it's not a silver bullet. Because if you don't have complementary investments in better policies, complementary investments in infrastructure, in markets, in input supply systems, in institutional changes, in extension systems, etc., then technology by itself is not going to create the change that you need. So one of the lessons that we've learned very hard through the Green Revolution process, that changes in productivity requires a multifaceted approach. And I think as we look forward, we need to keep reminding ourselves of this lesson and think about it very seriously. Now, where did the Green Revolution work? It's not surprising that the places where the Green Revolution worked were the places which had the highest scarcity of food. These were the places which had the highest scarcity of land, highest population densities. But these were also places which had very good market infrastructure. So it's not surprising that the initial switch, the initial sweep of the Green Revolution took place in India, especially in the more irrigated, more favorable producing parts of India, such as the Indian Punjab. It took place in Java. It took place in parts of the Philippines. It took place in parts of China, etc. All of these, when you look across them, were all very densely populated areas. These were all areas with very good irrigation infrastructure and very good market infrastructure. The other thing about the Green Revolution, while people glibly talk about the Green Revolution across all crops, the reality is that the significant change in productivity took place in 3 crops. It took place in rice, wheat, and maize. Those were the 3 crops where the big changes took place. Since then, the CGIAR system has been trying to create green revolutions in a broad variety of crops. And yes, they have made progress, and they have made significant change. But the big dramatic change that we think of as the Green Revolution was very much focused on 3 crops. And that's something that we should be remembering. Now, where did the Green Revolution not work? It's very clear that there are significant conditions under which the Green Revolution does not work. And many of them are the flip side of the last slide that I showed you. Essentially, the Green Revolution does not work in areas where there's low demand conditions, either because population densities are low, or market infrastructure is low, or both of them are the case. And that's been the case for much of sub-Saharan Africa through the 60s, through the 70s, and even through the 80s for large parts of Africa. So initially, when people were talking about creating a green revolution in Africa, in the 70s, it was quite clear that at that time, the strategy for Africa was not one of rapid increases in yields. Today, as you look at Africa, you have a different scenario. Today, you've got several parts of Africa where population densities are high enough that the returns to intensification is high, and that there are potentials for getting high returns to green revolution type investments in productivity improvement. The second areas where you don't see green revolution type productivity growth taking place is areas which are more marginal, areas which are low rainfall areas, or in some cases, very high rainfall areas where flooding and submergence can be a problem, where drought is a big issue, where low soil fertility is a big issue, where sloping lands are a problem, etc. These are areas where one would not anticipate that you will see dramatic improvements in intensification and dramatic improvements in productivity. Orphan crops is the third area. As I mentioned, much of the investments that took place very early on were investments that benefited from a backlog of scientific and agriculture research that was done in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in Korea, etc. But there was no backlog of research for cassava. There was no backlog of research for millets and many of the other tropical crops. And so as you look today and as you look at the history of the Green Revolution, much of the tropical crops which very poor populations depend on did not have the benefit of the same extent of research and the same extent of R&D that you've seen for the big staple crops, rice, wheat, and maize. And we've already talked about what happened to sub-Saharan Africa. Over the years, over the past decades, there have been several questions about the Green Revolution, and there have been volumes written about it, and most of you know that literature. Let me pick up a few issues as we go along. What happened to farm sizes? Did small farmers benefit from the Green Revolution? People always ask this question. And if you look at the record is very clear, absolutely. The average farm size in the Indian Punjab in the 70s and in the 80s was 1 hectare. The average farm size in China when the Green Revolution was taking off was 1 mu. 1 mu is 1/15 of a hectare. It's the size of an American football field. The average size in the Philippines was under a hectare. These were the farms on which the Green Revolution took place. The Green Revolution did not take place on large farms. The literature talked about large farms, and there the large farms that the literature talked about were 3 to 5 hectares. And that was the big difference that we see compared to what we call large farms in Asia relative to what are large farms in this part of the world. The second is what happened to labor markets. Many of the very poor in Asia are populations who have no land. And so the question is, did these landless populations benefit at all from the Green Revolution? And what did happen was intensification resulted in increasing employment on the farms where the Green Revolution took place or where productivity increase took place. Because you switch from growing 1 crop a year to growing 2, sometimes 3 crops a year. You saw increases in employment opportunity for land preparation, for transplanting, for weeding, for harvesting, for post-harvest operations. These employment opportunities then created benefits for the landless labor populations, not just in the villages that they were living in, but in areas quite far away from where they were living in also. So you had migration streams taking place, going from eastern India towards the Indian Punjab during the harvesting season to benefit from the employment opportunities that were resulting from the higher harvest taking place in the Indian Punjab. That type of changes that took place in employment are something that we don't actually talk about enough when we think about the Green Revolution. But the Green Revolution was not always good. The Green Revolution did have significant consequences. And one of the consequences is much of the benefits went to men rather than women. And one of the reasons for that is women did not have access to land, did not have titles to land. And because of that, it turned out that women were not able to get credit, were not able to get inputs, etc. But you also had a fairly clear discriminatory effect because extension systems, promotions of technologies, credit systems, etc., were much more biased towards men than women. So over time, you began to see that much of the benefits that came out of the Green Revolution had a gender bias to them. And there is now an increased recognition of that and trying to figure out a way to change that and go beyond that. Then certainly there was a difference geographically between areas that are very favorable, the more irrigated, the higher rainfall areas, relative to the unfavorable production environment. So over time, you began to see concentrations of poverty in the more unfavorable production environments. And that's been very clear. Even today, we are grappling with interregional differences. We're grappling with differences between Eastern India relative to the rest of India. We're looking at differences between Western China relative to the rest of China, etc. So there are these significant interregional differences that have come about because of differences in agroclimatic potential and the ability to intensify. So there have been significant limits to Green Revolution-led growth. And these limits, as we've talked about, have come about primarily because of not having a clear, multifaceted approach to technological change in some cases. They may have come about because of very specific crops for which the Green Revolution can work and very specific production environments. And because of that, as you look back, you begin to see that the problem of poverty and the problem of food insecurity is not a problem that's gone away today, 40, 50 years after the Green Revolution started. Because the technology itself has not been able to address the very structural problems associated with poverty and food insecurity. And that requires a lot more policy and institutional changes than what a Green Revolution-led technological change can do. But I also believe that the success of the Green Revolution itself created a sense of complacency that then resulted in not keeping as much pressure on sustaining productivity growth, on expanding areas under productivity growth, etc., which could have then further pushed some of the poverty numbers down. As we think about the Green Revolution, there are significant unintended consequences that are very clear. And I think it's important for us to recognize what those are and figure out how to manage them, especially as we think about the future and think about future ways in which productivity growth can take place. It's very clear that over time, in areas with intensification, we've seen dramatic increases in chemical fertilizer use. And we've seen dramatic increases in pesticide use and water use. Now, as you think about what the kind of optimal level of input use relative to what's being used today in many of these Green Revolution areas, it's quite clear that chemical fertilizer use is way beyond what one would consider optimal, and what one would consider ways in which you can reduce the current levels of chemical fertilizer use without having a detrimental effect on yields. There are technologies out there, there are management practices out there which will allow you to reduce the amount of chemical fertilizer use. We also know that you can grow a very good rice crop without any insecticides today. You can grow a very good crop of maize with very little insecticides or pesticides today because of the disease and insect resistance that's already been built into these crops through generations of crop improvements that have taken place. Then you ask the question, why is it that you still see such high and injudicious levels of input use taking place? And part of the problem is a policy problem. If there are high levels of subsidies that are provided to the use of chemical fertilizers, then why should we blame farmers for not learning about more efficient techniques for using chemical fertilizers? Similarly, if there's very high levels of subsidies given to pesticide use, then why should we blame farmers for not giving up pesticide use and going into IPM strategies? So some of the problems that we've seen are problems that could have been fixed through better policies. But the political economy around these policy changes have been so severe and significant that it's been very hard to turn them around and change them. And I know that from the current levels of fertilizer use in the Indian Punjab and the struggle that's there within India itself to being able to remove the fertilizer subsidies that exist in that country. That's the same story with water. We know from all of the agronomic work that's been taking place that you can grow a very good rice crop with 1/3 the level of water that it uses today. But water continues to be free, or it continues to be so cheap that it doesn't make sense for farmers to be able to improve their efficiency of water use. We keep complaining about declining groundwater tables. But as long as power for pumping water continues to be provided at very, very low cost to farmers, then you're not going to solve the problem of declining water tables. So these are some of the big policy challenges that we are facing as we look ahead. The incentive side of the story is very clear. If you change the incentive structures for input use, you will see some changes in input use efficiencies taking place. But that's only one side of the story. The other side of the story is that you need better technologies for managing input use efficiencies. And that's been a big challenge. It's been a big challenge because many of these technologies are location specific. And they're very hard to transfer because they're very knowledge intensive. And that's a challenge that the entire agriculture science community has been facing for the last 20, 30 years and haven't had a solution to it. In my last 10 minutes, let me go through and see what the challenges are as we look ahead. As we look ahead, I think Asia is now at a point of thinking about what it should do about agriculture productivity growth as it looks across the next 20, next 30-year time period. And Asia is in a very unique situation of having been the forerunner of Green Revolution-led productivity growth. And I think some of the big challenges Asia is facing today is how do you sustain that productivity growth? Much of Asian rice and wheat and maize productivity have leveled off. How do you now create a boost to the next level of productivity growth in these systems? And to do it in a sustainable manner through lower levels of input use and improved productivity overall. The second big challenge that Asia faces is how do you improve competitiveness of cereal crop production systems? Much of Asian Green Revolution took place in an environment where trade in food commodities was either banned or not very open. But as Asia opens up, then how do you create an environment where you see increased competitiveness of rice, wheat, and maize production systems? And that's going to be a big challenge, reducing cost per ton of production while increasing productivity. The third challenge for Asia is wherever you go in Asia today and you talk to farmers and you ask them, what do you think are the 3 biggest problems that you face? One of the top 3, no matter where you go, is labor. Labor shortages is one of the biggest problems in Asia today, even though you're talking about one of the most densely populated parts of the world. This is true in Bangladesh, this is true in India, this is true in China. So as you look ahead, the implications of that for scale are quite clear. But how do you create a way in which you have scale economies when you have smallholder agriculture systems? And how do you make that transformation? That's going to be a big challenge. And the last challenge for Asia is how do you manage interregional differences? How do you manage to reduce poverty levels in places like Eastern India and bring Eastern India along that same growth pathway that the rest of India is on? And how do you use agriculture as an engine of growth to make that happen? In the case of Africa, we are seeing things quite differently. When we started to talk about the Green Revolution in Africa, we said much of the continent had low and inelastic demand conditions, very low population densities, very poor market infrastructure. But many parts of Africa today are looking quite different in terms of population densities. And their ability to intensify agriculture systems has changed quite dramatically. But the big challenge for Africa relative to Asia is, in Asia, one could say, let's focus on rice and wheat, and that covered the whole continent. In Africa, you don't have that luxury. You've got a heterogeneity in crops, a heterogeneity in farming systems. And so this broad sweeping investments in a few commodities is not going to be as useful. So the challenge for Africa is to create a green revolution, to create a process of intensification that takes into account the commodities and the crops that are really important to the poor, but that don't have the scale that you see in rice, wheat, maize, etc. The other challenge for Africa is you're starting with a very low agriculture R&D capacity, which is very different from the way where Asia was at the start of the Green Revolution, and very low levels of investments in the overall enabling environment, roads, transport, irrigation infrastructure, etc., and a policy environment that doesn't promote, doesn't provide the incentives for increasing productivity, etc. So those are some of the big challenges, I think, as we look at both Asia and as we look at Africa. But in addition to that, I think there's some bigger overriding challenges. I think one of the questions that I've had for a long time now is that much of the initial boost to the Green Revolution came about through very significant policy drives that took place, through input subsidy schemes, credit subsidy schemes, etc. But then it turns out that many of these policies tend to be extremely sticky, and it's very hard to change them. So how do you create a sustainable pathway to productivity growth that does not rely on such heavy subsidies, such heavy incentives, incentive distortions in a way for promoting productivity growth? That's a challenge, and I don't think I have the answer to figure that out. The second big challenge, I think, for both Asia and Africa as we look ahead is, while the first Green Revolution was a public sector-driven Green Revolution, as we look to the future, much of the R&D work is now in the private sector. How do you get the advances in R&D that the private sector is doing and bring that to be focused on the needs of the poor? That's a huge challenge, and I don't think we've got enough good examples on how to do that. The last is an issue of climate change. Climate change is a reality. I don't have to lecture you on that. But what does it mean for us in the agriculture community? I think in the agriculture community, while a lot can be done in terms of using agriculture as a way to mitigate effects of climate change, there's also a lot we can do in terms of adapting to climate change. So as we push towards productivity, we should also be looking at ways in which you adapt these crops to drought conditions, flooding conditions, etc. And that's a lot of work is going on in this area, and a lot more needs to be done. So my last closing words here is, in a sense, the first Green Revolution was a harvest of low-hanging fruits. But as we look ahead, we have to find ways in which we can harvest fruit that are at higher levels, that are more difficult to get. And they're more difficult to get because they're orphan crops, because they're very marginal environments, because the crop management technologies that are needed to sustain productivity are more harder to deal with. And because the farm sizes we're working with are small, but they're becoming even smaller because of population growth. So these are huge challenges as we look ahead. But we've done it before, and I'm sure we can do it again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prabhu. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions for a minute, and we'll let Professor Phil Pardey come up and talk about ag technology and productivity gains. And then the three of us will sit up here, and I'll moderate a discussion. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ros and Wally, for inviting me here. And I just couldn't understand, as I said to Ros, why I couldn't get away with this being a modulated Midwestern accent. But I guess you'll figure that out for yourself. Prabhu, I think, provided a really great landscape for the contextual difficulties and successes and related to the Green Revolution of past and looking forward in the future. And what I'm going to do is try and flesh that out with some new and still evolving data around two very specific aspects, one related to agricultural productivity and one related to the investments and nature of R&D that gives rise to those productivity growth, or as one of the drivers, not the only driver by any means. And I say still emerging data because that's what it is. I don't think the fundamental story I've got to tell is going to change as we tidy up the data. But quite a bit of this evidence is being put together with folks in my centre at Minnesota, but also a lot of work we're doing on behalf of the Gates Foundation, particularly for Prabhu's shop, to try and a project called Harvest Choice, which is co-executed by IFPRI in Washington, DC, and my centre in Minnesota, with an idea to try and give rise to more evidence-based decision-making, not just within the Gates Foundation, but more generally with national decision-makers and private sector and so forth. And so what you'll see is some of the tip of a very large iceberg of work myself and my colleagues have been doing over the last few years in this regard. As Prabhu indicated, and I guess it's just a presage, a theme of my talk is to try and get the temporal scaling and scope of what we're talking about right. And so to that end, we've been trying to put together a lot of longer-term data series so that you can see how economic forces and productivity and R&D factors play their hand out over appropriate periods of time, which are decadal, not years. And what I've got here is a pretty long-run set of commodity prices for the US, which I'll just use here as representative of basic commodity prices. These are deflated, so they're real commodity prices. And you can see 3 periods of very substantial price spikes in these commodity prices. So there's the more contemporary price spikes in 2007 and beyond. But you can see them in context with respect to the price spikes which was in Prabhu's slide back in 1970 and some earlier price spikes back in the 30s. It's evident that each flux of prices was essentially a doubling of real commodity prices, but in real terms the current spike peaked at much lower levels than the earlier spikes. And lots of attention has been drawn back to hunger and food security concerns as a consequence of those spikes. And as devastating as they may be for some folks, I'm not going to concentrate remarks on those spikes. I'm going to concentrate my remarks on the intertemporal periods, the long-run structural movements in commodity prices and what are the past and potential future drivers of those. And it basically boils down to some simple economics 101 with respect to what's the relative rates of change in global commodity supply versus commodity demand. On the demand side, we have amongst the economic profession not a consensus by any means, but perhaps more clarity on the drivers of demand over the longer run in terms of population and per capita income, and also policy-induced distortions that shift and divert maize away from food sources and feed sources into biofuels and so forth. And so there's a sense of that going forward, debatable as that might be, but there's even much larger uncertainty about what the pace of supply is going forward. And so the big question is, are we going to return to these sort of interspike trends of the past and return to a period of declining or level real prices, or are the current price spikes masking something more fundamental, that is a structural change in these commodity prices? And that's the big question on the table. If we are looking at real commodity prices trending upwards over the next 20, 30 or 40 years, that's a very different future than what we've experienced over the last 50 or 60 years. And so one of the big drivers on the supply side is productivity. Just to give some very quick context of global agricultural production, I put up here a couple of slides to just illustrate that while we've got these aggregates of production up here, there's quite a lot of variation between continents and within and between countries within continents in terms of the structure of production. So it's no surprise to most folks that in sub-Saharan Africa, a much higher share of production is in the roots and tubers than in other parts of the world, and a substantially lower share of the production is in on the red bar charts there goes into livestock production, compared with, say, Western Europe, where about half of the total value of production is livestock related. The other thing is that we think of agriculture taking up this very expansive physical footprint, and the estimates are, probably David knows the numbers better than I, but around 41% of the world's land mass is in agriculture. But if you look through an economic lens, agriculture is a very spatially specific sector, and in fact, if I can cause the slide to come up here, what I've done is arrayed countries from left to right, from the largest to the smallest countries in terms of their value of agricultural production in the 2007-2009 period. And what you can see here is that just 5 countries constitute more than half of the world's entire agricultural production in value terms. And just sort of think about that for a minute. That's a huge spatial concentration in the value of production. 5 countries, more than half of the world's production. In sub-Saharan Africa, which constitutes but 6% by my estimates here of global value of production, around 6 countries constitute the entire production of that continent. So there is a notion, I think, that agriculture, as I say, is very expansive, and it certainly is in terms of its practice, but in terms of the economics of that sector, with respect to value of production, it's highly spatially concentrated. If you peel down from below aggregate values of production to specific commodities, you get much the same sort of pattern in the data. So if you go commodity by commodity by commodity, typically 10 countries account for 65, 70, 80, upwards of 90% of the entire world's production, just 10 countries. And so whilst we may be, and we are very concerned about the impacts of commodity prices on poor producers and consumers in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, you need to be very mindful of the fact that a lot of the implications of what goes on with respect to productivity and production elsewhere in the world impacts commodity prices and feeds through into those markets. And so we need to pay attention to those factors as we look forward. If we look at per capita production trends, again by commodity here, and comparing the sub-Saharan Africa on the right-hand scale there and the rest of the world, we can see very different patterns over the past 40 or 50 years, with essentially a flat lining on per capita terms within sub-Saharan Africa of commodity production, and a more or less upward trend with respect to per capita production. This is not per area or whatever in the rest of the world. This doesn't reflect a failure of output growth in sub-Saharan Africa vis-a-vis the rest of the world. It turns out that, in fact, on aggregate, the VOP stands for the value of production. In real terms, the value of production, by these estimates here, its rate of growth has slightly, in sub-Saharan Africa, slightly exceeded the rate of growth in the rest of the world. It's just that we've got a substantially higher rates of population growth, 2.7% per annum over this entire period in sub-Saharan Africa, versus about 1.7% in the rest of the world. So with just that sort of quick sketch of the general sort of production structure and price trends in the world, what do we actually know, and what do we think we know about agricultural productivity trends? And I've spent probably a professional lifetime trying to sort of peel this onion, and every time I peel off another slice it gets more and more complicated, which is sort of the nature of scientific progress or regress in my case. And what I'm going to try and share with you is what do we actually know, and what are the sort of complications as I see them for getting to sort of meaningful perspectives about what's driving the sources of productivity growth so that we can get a lever on the policy handles that Prabhu pointed out that we need to move forward over the next several decades. A lot of our measured views of the world go back to 1960 or 61 because that's where the FAO prices and quantities start. And what we've been trying to do is push those, that evidence back at least to the turn of the last century. And so here's some comparatively long-run yield trends for major commodities globally. So this is global averages across all the producers that we could lay our hands on. And you can see a very systematic pattern across all of those commodities in the trends in the rates of growth of those yields. And this is probably the simplest and most intuitively obvious measure of productivity. That is, most productivity measures boil down to a measure of output over input, and here we've got a particular output, a particular crop over a particular input, in this case land. And so for the first 30 years of this data from 1920 to 1960, no commodity recorded a global rate of growth in excess of 1% per annum, and most of them were substantially lower than that. We hit the period that Prabhu was talking about, the Green Revolution period, and we have this dramatic uptick in the rates of growth. These are really substantial. These are compound rates of growth. In many cases, more than a doubling of the rates of growth in yields for these commodities globally through the 1960 to 1990 period. From 1990 onwards, we see a very different pattern. The red indicates that every one of those global yield averages is showing a slowing rate of increase. It's not a decrease in yield, but a slowing rate of increase in yields over the post-90 period relative to the Green Revolution period that Prabhu was talking about. And so the question is that the future we're sort of consigned to, or worse, or are we able to sort of return to the higher rates of growth that we observed in the 60s, 70s and 80s? The other thing that is a surprise to us still, and we're still trying to untangle what's going on here, is that whilst we see the median yields, so these are distributions across countries in crop yields. So what I'm plotting here is in the red, on the vertical axis, the density function of the number of countries arrayed by the country-specific yields that we see for the first few decades of the 20th century and the last couple of decades. And you can see something quite remarkable. As you'd expect from the previous slide, the median yields have been increasing from then to now, but the spatial spread of yield performance, of yield levels, has increased dramatically. So those red distributions are much tighter. It means that the cross-country variation in yields was much more muted at the beginning of the 20th century than it has been in the last few decades. So something's going on here that's causing an increase in the diversity of yield performance across countries over this 100 years or so of evidence. And I'll throw up a few ideas, and maybe in the questions some of you might have other ideas about what's going on here, but I think in terms of you mask lots of important variation if we're just dealing with these sort of regional or global averages as opposed to diving down to something more spatially disaggregated, and I'll go even sub-country level in some of the data I put up. And particularly in the project we've been doing for the Gates Foundation, we have been going sub-country, and what we've been doing is dividing the world up into 10 by 10 kilometre grids, which gives us massive amounts of data, and trying to come up with estimates, global estimates of the production, area and yield performance on this gridded view of the world. And so it was motivated by naive questions we asked about 10 or 15 years ago as do we know where in the world wheat is grown and rice and corn and so forth? And it turns out we didn't. And so we've spent a lot of money and a lot of effort by some smart people to try and develop some techniques to come up with plausible spatial distributions of these very basic sorts of data on crop area, production and yield at this pixelated level. And what I've done here is got maize, wheat, soybeans and rice, and you can see they have very different spatial footprints if you glance across those maps and where in the world those crops are grown. And I've coloured them so that we're going from the light to the dark is going from the lower to the higher yield decile. So I've got those yield distributions I had up in the previous slide and spliced them up and grouped countries into deciles. And then you can go and do some calculations and look at, for example, for these maize, wheat, soybean and rice, what share, and this is what this pop-up shows, what share of the area within the US accounts for the top 3 yielding deciles globally. All right, so what it's saying is that the US, 32% of the maize area in the US accounts for the top 3 yielding deciles globally. You can see that South Africa and Africa have a much lower share of the world's high-yielding deciles for each of those commodities. And so there's dramatic differences even within countries in terms of these yield performances. This is my slide of the Green Revolution and beyond on one slide, from only through an economist's lens. And I call it a ratanogram because it was invented by Vern Rattan and Yujiro Hayami probably about 40 years ago. And I've sort of kept updating these slides over time, and they're extremely revealing. And what they're basically doing is measuring, on the vertical axis, we're measuring agricultural output per hectare, so we can call that a measure of land productivity. On the horizontal axis, we're measuring agricultural output per unit of labour, so that's a labour productivity. The figures across the top here are measuring hectare per worker. So those diagonal lines indicate, in economic jargon, factor intensity. So they're indicating the number of hectares per worker in agriculture. So as you go from the top left to the bottom right of the slide, you're increasing the number of hectares per worker in agriculture. So you've got Australia and New Zealand are tracking along in terms of their land and labour productivity, and basically holding land-labour ratios more or less constant at about 750, 800 hectares per worker in agriculture. You've got sub-Saharan Africa down there, who's had much smaller rates of land and labour productivity growth, so the length of these lines indicate the rates of growth, and the position of these lines indicate factor intensities. And because the sub-Saharan African line is heading vertical, it means it's decreasing the number of hectares per worker, whereas most of the other regions or countries of the world are either maintaining or decreasing the number of hectares per worker in agriculture. Today, where does sub-Saharan Africa's labour productivity sit relative to the rest of the world? It sits about where China and Asia were about 30 years ago, is the average labour productivity for sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly, sub-Saharan African land productivity exceeds land productivity in my home turf in Australia and New Zealand, which is an interesting thing to contemplate. But there's very different labour productivity performances, obviously, in Australia and New Zealand vis-a-vis sub-Saharan Africa. So there's these complex forces that are giving rise to very different structures of input use in different parts of the world. These patterns are very consistent, so this is nearly 50 years of data. They move over time, and they move in different directions for different countries and different regions of the world, but there's a consistency, so there's some fundamental forces positioning these places within this landscape here. So it shows a lot of heterogeneity in even just these two productivity performances. And even within sub-Saharan Africa, huge heterogeneity within the continent. So what I did was took the sub-Saharan African locus of land and labour productivity from the previous slide and then split out sub-regions within sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see this huge variation in terms of factor intensity, hectares per worker, and huge variation in terms of the directions of those factor intensities. So Eastern and Central Africa are heading to substantially less hectares per worker, whereas in South Africa and Nigeria, they're trending to more hectares per worker. And again, the length of the line is an indication of the rates of productivity growth, so very different spatial performances in terms of productivity growth in that part of the world. So these are just the tip of some icebergs of some productivity measures. How can we actually, what do they actually mean? How can we go beyond just describing this to getting a more in-depth understanding of what these mean and the implications for policy and so forth? There's a body of work, it's actually a surprisingly small body of work that economists have done to try and come up with regional measures of productivity growth that are comparable across countries and over time. And there's just an array of a selection of some of those studies, the year in which they were done, the methods, and so a variety of methods, a variety of years and a variety of countries in them. So there's quite a bit of variation in the studies. The one thing they have in common is they all use more or less the same underlying data. They all use FAO, Food and Agriculture Organisation data, and World Bank data. So they're all going to be limited in terms of what we can find out from these studies, notwithstanding the different methodologies, by the underlying data that they use. And what is that data? For land, that data is basically a count in area of arable and permanently pastured and cropped land. It doesn't, most of the studies, some but not many of the studies even try and differentiate between irrigated and non-irrigated land. They basically tend to use sort of fairly crass aggregates of areas in agriculture. The labour input is a head count of economically active population in agriculture. No attempt to account for the massive change and shift to part-time farming. So one of the characteristics of agriculture in the US, but also in many of the countries that Prabhu was talking about, was a massive shift of labour out of agriculture. And it wasn't people leaving the farms, it was people shifting dramatically to part-time farming and working more and more of their hours off-farm than on-farm. Few, if any, attempts to account for changes in the structure of the labour in terms of hired versus operator and family labour, and between age structures and skill structures and education structures and so forth. Some of the studies try to adjust for those, but not many, and in a pretty rudimentary way. Capital variables in these studies are often just counts of tractors in use on farms. So they ignore all other forms of buildings and fencing and other machinery besides capital. A tractor in 1920 is unlikely to be like a tractor in 2007, and a tractor in Bangladesh is unlikely to be a tractor in Nebraska. So no attempt to account for the massive differences across time and space and the quality of the capital stock. Livestock variables are thrown in sort of ad hoc ways with not really a sense of why they're thrown in. Are they actually a sort of an inventory control item? Are they trying to measure something like a biological capital metric? And if they were, why do you throw in all of the livestock instead of just the breeding livestock and things like that? So lots of questions about how that variable is treated. And typically the extent of the materials inputs are just a measure of the quantity of fertiliser used. Often all other chemicals are left out, and all other sorts of inputs like energy inputs and things of that nature are omitted from the studies. So what are we actually measuring? What we're trying to measure in productivity measures is what's the rate of output change relative to the rate of input change? And if we're not properly measuring these things, we're going to be confounding lots of measurement issues and differences across countries and over time in those measures with things that are more substantive and fundamental. So our measurement problems are going to get in the way of our understanding of what's actually going on. There's a bunch of things that are going to affect that relationship between output and input. And I list 5 of them here, and I'm just going to briefly sketch out some of the practical empirical problems and conceptual problems we have in dealing with some of these, and some that we're trying to address in our work for the Gates Foundation. I'd preface it by saying I think probably most people in this room, if I asked would you prefer higher rather than lower rates of productivity growth, would stick their hand up and answer yes for that. In fact, as an economist, a reasonable response would be I'd prefer a lower rate of productivity growth than a higher rate of productivity growth. In fact, Nobel laureate Ted Schultz about 40 years ago had a prescient little footnote in an article of his, and he said, you know, I think the optimal output-input ratio is 1, and 1 for all times. That means that the rate of growth of the best measure of the rate of productivity growth is 0. And what he meant by that is that we're actually, as we get an increase in output, we're actually measuring the increases meaningfully, the measures of the increases of input that account for that output change. So and to the extent that we're getting output changes that are not measured by our changes in input, as another great economist said, it's just a measure of our ignorance. It's an unknown source of output change, and we wrap it up in a fancy title called productivity growth. And so to the extent we have higher rates of productivity growth, we're more and more ignorant about the sources of output growth. And the more fundamental concern is, how do we get more output growth, not how do we get higher productivity growth? All right. So one of the ways that we can actually increase productivity is to actually change the technical relationships between outputs and inputs, and we call that technical change. All right, so for the same measured level of inputs, you actually get more outputs. And we means we put the inputs together in things in ways that are hard to measure, that we're smarter with the timing of our planting and the way we sequence our operations on farms and the matching of the varieties that we use to the locations in which we plant them. They're all things that we poorly or don't measure, but we classify them as technical change, and they will tend to give rise to large increases in output relative to measured increases in input. Prabhu pointed to scale effects, which give rise to very substantial gains in terms of specialisation and in terms of integration of farming operations and on-farm operations with off-farm operations. So lots of growth in agriculture you see is by this better matching of the production processes with supply chains off-farm and scale effects. However, and Prabhu pointed to the problem, it doesn't necessarily mean agglomerating farms, but thinking about ways of coordinating production in ways to get those scale economies, I think, is an important source of productivity gains. Another source of gains, and more often a complication of measuring the relationship between outputs and inputs, is the issue of intermediate, or what I call inside inputs. Agriculture is really different than most other forms of, most other sectors that we look at, in the sense that it's a biologically driven production process. It's very different from making iPods and cars and things like that, nature like that. So it's beholden to biological production processes. And in fact, a lot of, in history, and I'll show you a pretty dramatic slide in the US, a lot of the activity on farms is to produce intermediate inputs that are used to then produce outputs. And I'll give you a couple of examples of those. And big structural changes in terms of what inputs are produced on-farm versus off-farm is part of the process we've seen with respect to technological transformations and productivity transformations in other parts of the world, and it's a process that's barely begun in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And the other related aspect to that is mismeasured or omitted inputs. So one of the conundrums in trying to deal with productivity growth in agriculture is to get really good measures of changes in labour and land. As I said, we often have head counts of labour and head counts and acres of land, but an acre is not an acre and a head count is not a head count. And so trying to get a qualitative measures that are meaningful and include them in our output measures, in our input measures, is a way of having a better handle and a better understanding on the sources of output growth. And finally, agriculture is also very distinctive in that because of these biological production processes, it uses a lot of natural inputs which are typically omitted because we don't either have quantity measures for them or we don't have price measures for them. Simple things like rainfall, wind, day length, temperature, soil attributes again, a set of inputs that I actually call exputs. So economists are used to a concept of netputs, which are quantity measures that take on a positive value if they're an output and a negative value if they're an input. An exput has a positive value as an input, but it causes a reduction in output. And we've been doing a lot of work on the Gates Foundation trying to get a handle on the extent and nature and scope of the pest and disease, the biotic pressures that limit and attenuate productivity performance, yield performance in parts of the world, and I'll show you one slide on that. And another aspect is that because of this biological process, where you produce, literally where you produce this production really matters, because the location comes embodied with a whole bunch of biological and natural input assets in terms of terrain and topography, soil characteristics, rainfall and things of that nature. So a lot of the productivity studies up to now are totally aspatial in a sense. They use national aggregate data or state or regional data. They don't really think about the location of agriculture in any meaningful sense. And so a lot of these attributes that have a very specific site-specific nature to them are actually left out of the analysis. And so it's part of our sources of ignorance about why we're getting differences in productivity performance over time and across countries. So that's my wish list of trying to chip away and at sort of trying to delve into this black box of productivity and sort of get a more meaningful understanding of productivity growth. So one of them sources is obviously technical change, and I've been chipping away trying to put this slide together for probably 5 or 6 years or so, and trying to drum up data on the extent and uptake of technologies in the US. And whilst I've been spending most of my time working for Prabhu on sub-Saharan Africa, in areas where there's very scarce and scanty and questionable data, I'm very mindful when I turn back to the US, it takes a lot of work to get it, but lying around in the bowels of the National Statistical Service and ag censuses and so forth, you can drum up pretty interesting evidence that gives you a quantitative sense of the pattern of change of really substantial technologies that affected agriculture. So here's a slice of them. And what I'm measuring here is either the area by crop that's in genetically modified corn or soybeans, or in semi-dwarf rice and wheat, which were key technologies of the Green Revolution, or the share of farms that are using tractors or telephones or are electrified and so forth. And the point to note here is that these are from the point of when the technology is commercialised to when it's taken up by US farmers. And even for GE corn, it took 13 years from the point that genetically modified corn was commercialised to reach 80% market penetration in the US, 13 years. It took 18 years from the point of commercialisation for hybrid corn to spread out over the Midwest. These things don't happen in 2 or 3 years, even in the US. They happen over decades. So that's just something to keep in the back of your mind as you're thinking about what's driving productivity growth. If this technical change is a big driver of productivity growth, it plays its hand out over decades, not years. This problem of intermediate or inside inputs is one just in the last couple of years that I've become, is sort of crossed my radar as something that's actually, I think, a major misunderstood, certainly by me, but I think by many others, aspect of the technological transformation that's taken place in virtually every country that I know of. And what it is, as I say, that there's a bunch of these primary or external inputs, so we've got land and labour and physical capital and things of that nature, that actually can do two things. They can produce these intermediate or inside inputs, or they can produce marketed or consumed outputs. And if you look at systems that have much lower levels of productivity, a substantially larger share of the primary and external inputs are being driven into producing intermediate or inside inputs, as opposed to being driven directly into producing marketed or consumed outputs. And it opens up areas, I think, of sort of policy and technological promise of thinking about the relative paces of technical change of that transformation from primary inputs to inside inputs, as opposed to inside inputs to final inputs, or directly from primary inputs to final inputs. And a really dramatic example of this is in the US, in the movement from farm-produced power to tractors. So it's quite dramatic. If you look over time from the middle of the 1800s through to the 1960s, have a look at the total horses and mules in the US, and that's on the left-hand side axis. That's millions of horses and mules over the US landscape that was used for traction power on US agriculture. The numbers are remarkable. In 1915, there were over 25 million horses and mules used for traction on US farms. And at that time, there were only literally 25,000 tractors in the whole of the US in 1915. In 1945, the number of work animals, that is horses and mules over 2 years of age, had dropped more than a half to just over 12 million. The number of tractors had grown from 25,000 to 2.4 million. So we've taken what was a lot of activity in terms of land and labour and so forth to support that farm-produced power, and used it now to produce marketable surpluses that go onto the market. We've sort of gone full circle. It turns out that we're now probably putting, 25–30% of our acreage into biofuels, which we sell mainly outside the sector. We were putting a quarter of the entire cropland acreage back in 1910, 1915 into growing feed to fuel horses and mules. And we had this dramatic decline in the area shares that were supporting that, and particularly in the labour that was required to maintain. I mean, a tractor, you stick it in the shed. The horses and mules, you have to feed them and tend them all year round. So the estimates are that we literally liberated so if you look at the cropland acreage in the US, it hasn't moved that much over the last 100 years or so, but in fact, we've put in 61 million more acres of cropland to produce marketable and consumable surpluses rather than farm-produced power over the period of this time. And we've freed up 2.3 million hours of labour every year, year in and year out, by switching to tractors and away from horses and mules. So understanding that process much more clearly, I think in parts of the world that I'm working in now, is potentially important. I went into our harvest choice data and just pulled out last week some numbers to show you the extent of external versus internal inputs that's being used in these three countries here. And you can see in Ethiopia, this is a nationally representative ag census. It's a survey of hundreds of thousands of farm households. In fact, you can see the number there, in fact, millions, 12.9 million householders surveyed in Ethiopia, 3.3 in Ghana and 4.4 in Kenya. So in Ethiopia, 2/3 of the farm households surveyed were using natural fertilisers, farm-produced fertilisers. So there's an opportunity cost of all the labour and the land and so forth that goes into that fertiliser production. Only 20% were using chemical fertilisers. Similarly in Kenya, 42% of the farms were using natural fertilisers. Very limited use of pesticides, very limited use of improved or purchased seed. For other countries where we've got spottier data, those numbers tend to be at that level or even lower. And so there's substantial parts of sub-Saharan Africa that are essentially using the labour, the land, saved seed and natural manures. That's pretty well it that's going into production agriculture. Very little injection of new technologies through new seeds or new machinery and so forth. So how we pull off that transformation in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, is a really big question. I'm not going to go through this slide in any detail, other than to say what we would like to measure is the thing on the right-hand side of the slide, which we call total factor productivity. What we actually measure is multi-factor productivity. Multi-factor productivity is the ratio of the quantity of included or measured outputs over included or measured inputs. Total factor productivity is the ratio of all of the included and excluded, that is the things we don't measure in output, and ditto for inputs. And to the extent, if you go through the math on this, it turns out, and just remember, so a lot of the excluded outputs are natural inputs like the weather attributes and things of that nature. As that changes over time, or our use of them in agriculture changes over time, we're going to change our measured views of productivity growth. And what it turns out is, as if the rate of growth of the things we're not measuring is going up at a faster rate in terms of inputs than the rate of growth of the inputs we are measuring, we're going to falsely think we've got higher rates of productivity growth than's actually going on. So if we're measuring land and we're measuring yield as our productivity measure, and we're measuring the rate of growth of area in agriculture relative to the rate of growth in output, we'll get a measure of yields. But if fertiliser use is going up at a faster or a slower rate than the rate of change in area, we're going to get a measured variation in our productivity measure. And so it may be just that we're using more fertiliser is why we're getting yield growth, or it may be something else. And so my thesis is that if we get more comprehensive measures of all of the sources of output growth, we're going to get a better understanding of this relationship between inputs and outputs. And here's a concrete example of what we've done for our Gates project on looking at the consequences just for a simple productivity measure of yield, of where we essentially are controlling for the level of fertiliser that's going into a production process. So what we've done on the Gates project is we've divvied the world up into these 10 by 10 kilometre grids, and we've got lots of terrain and soil and climate data and so forth, and we're actually modelling the growth of corn and other crops at each one of these pixels, given the agroecology of those pixels. But we can also control for management effects. And so here what we've done is we assumed that all of the area in maize in sub-Saharan Africa was grassland in 1960. We converted it into maize production, and we continuously cropped maize from then to 2000, but we assumed a very low levels of external inputs. So we were basically ploughing back in stover, if it was there, to the extent, and not adding in any other attributes to maintain soil fertility. And what you saw, and we simulate this year in and year out, so we're carrying over soil organic matter and carbon levels and things like that, and you simulate that over this period of time, and lo and behold, you end up with a map that more or less mimics the yield levels that you see in maize throughout sub-Saharan Africa today. We went from areas that could produce 4 tonnes per hectare to areas that were producing 0.5 tonne per hectare. And what that tells you is if you reverse the process and pay much more attention to sort of managing soil fertility and so forth, that's a more or less reversible process. But it gives you a better handle on thinking about what's driving that productivity measure by being very explicit about the excluded inputs, in this case fertiliser. To my exputs, these are inputs that have a negative impact on output. Here's a map or a graph of the losses in wheat production in the US just due to stem rust. So some of you have probably heard of UG99, which is a new variant of stem rust, which was first discovered in Uganda in 1999 and is starting to spread throughout Eastern Europe and elsewhere, Eastern Africa and elsewhere in the world. And it turns out few, if any, of the world's bread wheats have much measurable resistance to this form of stem rust. Well, it turns out lots of the wheat varieties grown in the US had very little resistance to stem rust up until the mid to late 60s. And there were losses in the US, as you can see here, of the wheat crop of 8 to 10% per year of the wheat crop. In the Dakotas and Minnesota, in some years, they had 40 to 60% losses in the wheat crop way up until the late 60s. And then suddenly you can see it turns off because we spent a lot of effort in R&D and so forth to try and build in resistance to stem rust. So it turns out over the period from 1918 to 1970, we wiped out nearly 1 billion bushels of production just due to stem rust in the US, which is about a total year's supply. In the upper Midwest, in the Minnesotas and Dakotas, we lost 3 years of production just due to that pest and disease problem. There's other forms of stem rust, other forms of rust that hit wheat. This is just one of them. So having a much better and explicit handle on the impacts of these diseases hopefully will give us an insight as to what the payoffs are to ameliorating those problems. And the other, quick finishing up the productivity story and then going very briefly to a few R&D slides, is unfortunately and fortunately the location of agriculture moves. So we tend to look at agriculture over a 5 or a 10 or a 15-year period. And here's a map that one of my graduate students has been working on for his PhD, trying to track the nature of movement of corn production and its implications for corn productivity from 1880 to 2007. And you can see something quite remarkable here, that all down the eastern seaboard and the southeastern states and so forth, this is highlighted by the share of each county's share in total US corn production. You can see in the 1880s the eastern seaboards and southern states were lighting up with reasonable counties growing corn, and look at them now. It's been flushed all out of those areas, and so 40% of the entire world's corn crop is grown in the US, and probably around 40% of that corn crop is grown within a couple of 100 miles of where I sit on a day-to-day basis. So there's this big spatial concentration in the location of production, and to the extent that that location comes with it all sorts of attributes about agroecology, climate, soil and so forth, we've changed the structure of the inputs into corn production just by moving the location of corn production. Trying to disentangle that is something Jason's been spending a couple of years on his degree, and he's getting pretty close to sort of having a couple of answers there. In terms of thinking about things like just physically relocating agriculture, what's been its impact on overall yield growth? It's a non-trivial number, just by moving it around the landscape. So to the extent that this has taken place on other crops in other countries, I think this is a large unmeasured source of getting a better handle on the nature of productivity growth. Very quickly, I'm going to whiz through just a couple of slides here to say we're looking at productivity growth. My concern is that we're actually entering a period of a productivity slowdown. As I start, unfortunately, looking at more and more evidence, I can see that up till the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was this differential performance on productivity measures, whatever they may be. And then if you look at the post-1990 period and compare it to the pre-1990 period, all of the red there indicates slower post-90 growth vis-a-vis pre-90 growth. Substantial shares of countries have slower post-90 growth in terms of the yields of these major crops than pre-1990 growth. And if you go to the broader measures of land and labour productivity, again, substantially large shares of countries are growing slower now, post-1990, than they did pre-1990. Luckily, down the bottom there, sub-Saharan Africa has fewer countries, share of their countries, growing at a slower rate post-1990 than pre-1990. The problem is that they're growing off a very low base. So whilst it's encouraging, it turns out that around 80% of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa have land productivity levels that are below the world average, and about half of them have labour productivity levels below the world average. In the US, we've done a very detailed study of multi-factor productivity growth and very dramatic declines in productivity growth in US agriculture. And these are especially worrying. If you think the US, as I said, produces 40% of the entire world's corn crop, about a third of its entire soybean crop, 10 to 15% of its barley and wheat crop. If US productivity growth stumbles, the implications of that on global food prices, I think, are quite profound. And we see nearly a halving in the compound rate of growth of multi-factor productivity growth in the US pre versus post-1990. Sub-Saharan Africa, I've been working with a colleague at the University of Pretoria, same thing. Basically, for the last 20 years, multi-factor productivity growth in Sub-Saharan Africa is flatlined, hasn't moved one iota. R&D is a big driver of productivity growth. I talked about how long it takes for new technologies to diffuse over the landscape. These are some illustrative sort of technology development lags to show you how long it takes to even get ideas to the point of commercialisation. And we work with folks at Monsanto to trace through the sort of research and inventive steps that led to BT corn and Roundup Ready soybean, and I tracked through the history of development of hybrid corn. And here is the time from the initial scientific discoveries and ideas to the point of commercialisation. So for hybrid corn, it was 59 years. For BT corn, it was 96 years. And for soybean, Roundup Ready soybean, it was 26 years. That's just to get to the point of commercialisation. And then you add 2 or 3 decades beyond that to move those technologies over the landscape. And that's the timeline of relating R&D spending to productivity growth that you have to think about. What's been going on in R&D spending? These are some still the beta versions of our data, but still new data in terms of the performance in terms of real investments in public sector ag R&D globally. And the unfortunate story here is that there's a huge gap opening up between the levels of investment in the high-income countries vis-a-vis sub-Saharan Africa, but a different and very optimistic pattern with respect to the levels of investments between Asia and Pacific and high-income countries. So back in 1960, the high-income countries as a group were investing about 6 times more than sub-Saharan Africa in ag R&D and about 4.5 times more than the Asia-Pacific region. In 2005, that gap had widened with respect to high-income countries versus sub-Saharan Africa investment levels of 11-fold, whereas the Asia-Pacific region had halved that gap and seemed to be on track to close that gap. Where in the world is this research conducted? These are updated data to 2005. Our estimates are that about $28 billion is spent on public sector ag R&D around the world. The US alone accounts for nearly 16% of that entire spending. Notably, China and India alone now exceed US investments in public ag R&D by my estimates here. The other high-income countries account for about 36%. So it's very roughly a 50-50 split, but big shifts in the structure of where that spending is being performed. The real concern for me is the next 2 slides. What's shown on the left here is the decadal rates of growth in real terms of the increase in R&D spending in the low and middle income countries, sub-Saharan Africa and the high income countries. And you can see those bar charts dropping down every decade. And what's that saying is that rates of growth of spending are going up at a slower rate decade after decade after decade. On the right-hand side, we've got some new and emerging numbers with respect to public and private spending in the OECD countries. And there is a notion that the private sector is stepping in to fill that gap. And our data question that notion. It is true during the 1980s there was a substantial run-up in private spending in food and ag R&D, but that also has dropped down in the 1990s and 2000s, as it has on public spending in the OECD countries. And importantly, when we think of private sector R&D spending, we might think of Monsanto and Pioneer DuPont. They're the wrong people to think about. You should be thinking about General Mills and those sorts of companies. Nearly 2/3 of all of that private food and ag R&D has got nothing to do with farm productivity. It's food processing R&D. So whilst there's been an increase in that R&D spending, whether or not that's actually doing anything with respect to productivity growth in ag is an open question. So the US has followed this same pattern of ramping down its rates of growth of public R&D spending, But the double whammy is that it's actually doing very different things now with respect to R&D spending than it did 20 or 30 years ago. So barely 56% of the spending in all of the land-growing institutions has got anything to do with farm productivity now. So all of the additional agendas in terms of the environmental footprint of agriculture, obesity, nutrition, biosecurity, all of those things, which have real social concerns and things we need to worry and research about, they've all been layered on to the research agenda, but not in addition to, but at the expense of maintaining and enhancing farm productivity research. So that's the reality, and the anecdotal evidence I have in European countries and Australia and elsewhere is that that same pattern has been going on elsewhere in the world. In terms of how intensive we invest in agriculture, that is the amount of R&D investment relative to the size of the sector. So you'd obviously expect a bigger country to put, or hope a bigger country puts more into ag R&D than a smaller country. To normalise between countries, we divide R&D spending by the value of agricultural output. And you can see on the right-hand side there this huge gap in terms of the level of intensity. So what this tells you is we're spending about $5.50 on private and public ag R&D in the rich countries for every $100 of ag output. In the poor countries, we're spending about 50 cents on R&D for every $100 of output. A big and growing gap in the intensity of investments in ag R&D between these countries. And the same thing going on in sub-Saharan Africa and in general, and particularly in places like South Africa, where we've been, as I say, doing a lot of work. And I mentioned that over the last 20 years, 15 to 20 years, multi-factor productivity growth is flatlined in sub-Saharan Africa. If you look at the top graph, you can see that over the last 30 or 40 years, real R&D spending in South Africa has flatlined. And so if we've got these long lags between when we spend R&D dollars and they show up in terms of having a productivity impact, it's no surprise that we're getting these productivity slowdowns when we've been ratcheting down the rate of growth of spending in R&D and diverting it away from things that enhance productivity growth. So I'm out of time and I have a list of points in closing here. And the bottom line is that whilst I'd like to be optimistic about the future, I'm frankly concerned. I think Prabhu pointed to this notion of complacency about the successes of the Green Revolution. And you can see that in these data, that there's been a backing away and a reorientation of public policy attention away from maintaining or enhancing productivity over the last 10, 20 years or so. And we're starting to see the price of that showing up in terms of fairly ubiquitous slowdowns in productivity growth. And so the big question on the table is, what's this future going to be like? So we did some very extensive work over the last few years to relate the patterns of R&D spending in the US to the patterns of productivity performance in the US, where we just happen to have a lot better data. And from 1949 to 2007, the average rate of productivity growth in the US was 1.8% per annum. From 1990 to 2007, it had dropped to 1.18% per annum. And on our basis of our econometric results, we projected forward to 2030 and 2040. And if the US didn't change anything in terms of the orientation of its R&D or the rate of its spending, our estimates are that the US is asymptoting to a 0.5% rate of multi-factor productivity growth. If that's emblematic of what's going on in the world, this is a long-run estimate we've been putting together of per capita, in real terms, per capita value of agricultural output, all agricultural output per capita. So back in 1990, the world was producing an average of $134 of agricultural output per capita. In 2000, it was producing $241 per capita. If we go to the long-run trend, that is the 1.78% per annum productivity growth going forward, our estimates are that we'll ratchet up to about $407 worth of output per capita by 2050. If we have a productivity performance in the future that's what's been emblematic of the US since 1990, we'll go to a $316 per capita output. But if the future isn't changed, we're on trend by these estimates to basically flatline with respect to the value of agricultural output per capita. If that's the future, then I'm worried. But the good news is it's actually a policy choice as to what that future is like. It's not set in stone, and I think hopefully some wise decisions will be taken, because the decisions taken now are actually going to determine what that figure is going to be in 2030, 2040. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Phil and Prabhu. And I came up with a question, but I'm noting the time here, so I want to open it up to the audience first, and I'll save my question for a lag. So any questions from the audience? Tom?
Yeah, question for Phil. So you laid out a number of dots there, and I was just wanting to ask you whether you would draw a connection between several of those. One, you noted the very long lag time from innovation or investment to actual adoption and implementation of the technology. Two, so maybe 25 years more. Two, this long-run decline in agricultural prices, since really quite dramatic, the long-run trend. And then three, the recent decline in agricultural productivity growth. Have you tried to link those, namely that this long-run decline in prices has played a role in, I mean, you're talking about policy decisions and so on, but there are underlying economic forces at work. If you believe in induced innovation, these prices, in some sense, drive the incentive to invest. Is this just a fallout from that long period of declining prices, and it will be reversed if we do face higher prices in the coming decades? Can you speculate about that, please?
You haven't done any formal analysis on that, Tom, but the same ideas have popped into mine and my colleagues' brains. And unfortunately, these processes play themselves out over such long periods of time that they're totally out of step with the sort of political processes that give rise to the commitments to build institutions and invest in human capital and science and so forth. And so, you know, you'd like to be optimistic, but you can see the debate going on here and in Europe now, and you wonder whether, even in the face of this evidence, I mean, when I first started getting a sense of a productivity slowdown, and it's very hard to disentangle a blip from a trend, but the more I keep looking at it, it seems like there's some structural shift going on in these productivity data, and it seems consistent with this earlier decline and change in decline in the rate of growth of spending and the orientation of that spending. So I'd like to hope that we can turn that around, and possibly increases in prices will give rise to political pressures to do that. But when you look at the sort of broader financial landscapes in the US and elsewhere, whether that story will carry the weight of the day in light of the other things that are bearing down on the policy processes at the moment would make me concerned.
Just,
Yeah.
But Phil, if you look at what's happening in China, Brazil, and India, there you're beginning to see fairly dramatic increases in R&D investments taking place, and partly resulting from price changes, but also just changes in demand domestically in those countries. And that may drive global productivity growth in the future.
Correct, although the Chinese case, which I know quite a bit about, I mean, those policy decisions were put in place well before price spikes, and so it was basically a policy concern looking to the long run about trying to meet domestic food demands as they evolve over time in that country. So, you know, I mean, the sorry story is if you look at the history of the US, where I showed you the share of the R&D that's oriented to maintaining or enhancing productivity growth, and I think it's also another difficult message to get across to policymakers, that we have these historically high yield levels. Just to sustain them, the evidence is that you have to put 40 to 70% of your R&D just to run hard to stand still, let alone to increase those yield levels. And so when you look back at that price spike in the 1970s, for 3 years, the research shifted back towards a more productivity enhancing orientation, but it lasted 3 years. And then the fundamental forces driving R&D spending, like in the US, ageing populations and so forth, that have pushed a lot of science and technology investment over into health R&D. I mean, the big gain is in health research, not in ag R&D over the last 20 or 30 years. I'm not sure those fundamental forces are going to go away in the high-income countries, and they're the bigger sort of political economy drivers of sort of science spending, perhaps that would trump even commodity prices, because at the end of the day, whilst we gripe about them, they don't actually hit us too dramatically in terms of our back pockets, but they hit a lot of people elsewhere in the world dramatically. So
before you ask your question, I'll ask for you to introduce yourself. The last person that asked the question was Tom Hurdle, who is visiting the Center on Food Security and Environment this year from Purdue, and we're happy to have you here, Tom. Wally?
Prabhu, you mentioned
This is Wally Falcon, who's the Deputy Director of Food Security Environment.
Sorry, I have a short memory span. Prabhu, as you were speaking about what happened in Asia, you said that it was a free flow of information and that intellectual property did not get in the way. I'd like to have both you and Phil speculate on how serious a constraint, if one at all, intellectual property is going to be in Africa's attempts to increase productivity in the next 25 years. Is it going to be a big drag, no drag at all, or even a positive?
I'll start. And I think if you look at many of the orphan crops that we need to work on in Africa, I don't think IP is going to be the constraint to improving productivity on those crops, because the stock of research knowledge there is so little, and there's very little that's in the private sector, etc. But if you think about targeting drought and improving tolerance to drought for maize in Africa, for example, then IP could be a big constraint in getting private sector R&D in drought to be used for African germplasm, etc. So that's an area where many of us are working on and trying to see how to make that happen. Cool.
Yeah, with respect to sort of intellectual property on plant varieties, the weight of the evidence is that most of the intellectual property worldwide's got nothing to do with food staple crops. It's actually most of the varietal-related intellectual property, and there's different forms of that, from utility patents to plant breeders' rights and so forth. About 68% of those rights worldwide are focused on high-valued fruits, vegetables, ornamentals and grasses. That's where the money is. And so whilst there is non-trivial intellectual property around staple food crops, it's much smaller than people think, and as Prabhu mentioned, it's much more highly circumscribed jurisdictionally. It's mainly held within a very limited number of jurisdictions, not in sub-Saharan Africa, and so to the extent that the property rights only pertain to the jurisdiction in which the rights are held, they don't have any demonstrable impact in terms of access to technology, say in sub-Saharan Africa. I think the concern when I talk to biotech companies and so forth who are working on projects that the Gates Foundation is sponsoring, say jointly with CIMMIT and elsewhere, they're more worried about the jargon they use is the stewardship of those technologies, that is the misuse of those technologies in markets where they have little influence and there's little regulatory oversight in the use of those markets, and that feeding back on the application of those technologies into markets that are quite regulated. So it's not an IP issue, but there are issues that are of a commercial nature that do affect the willingness, I think, of IP holders to allow those technologies to be used in markets where there's comparatively little management or understanding of the implications of these modern technologies and how to steward them.
David?
David Lobel from FSE. So you both talked about time lags, and I think two real critical ones are the time lag between R&D and the actual implementation in the field. The other, the time lag, or what Prabhu called the stickiness, between when policies are useful and when they become counterproductive, or when policies are needed and when they actually come along. Are those both sort of the fundamental laws that have to be obeyed, or is there any evidence or opportunity to really shrink those time lags? You can talk about the technology piece, the policy piece, or both. If prices get high, how quickly can things move if we really want? Is GMOs going to change it? Is the policy will going to change?
I'll speak to the technology front, and get asked that and think about that quite a bit, Dave. And I think that the evidence is hard to disentangle about how elastic the technology response would be, say, to price changes and so forth. My judgment, and that's all it is, no formal analysis, is that it's pretty hard to turn that spigot on and off. As I said, if you go from hybrid corn to genetically modified corn, you gained 4 or 5 years in the movement of that technology over the US landscape, but you lost a bunch of years because there's now regulatory hurdles that have to be jumped to get the GM corns to market that didn't have to be jumped and don't have to be jumped to get hybrid corn to market. So, over the total development and commercialisation span, I don't think, to me, there's any compelling evidence one way or another that we've actually shortened the lag. I mean, there's lots of talk about that and promise and hope that we have, but I still think it just, and we may have done, but I think it's probably marginal. I mean, one hope would be, and that I have, is that we can actually get a radical increase in the rates of technology transfer between countries and within countries. And, essentially, if you look at the Green Revolution technologies, it was pretty haphazard, and it was basically personality politics that to some degree, I mean, there were some fundamental economic forces going on that caused those technologies from the CG centres. It was you read a lot of Norman Borlaug's history, and it was the weight of his personal powers, persuasions and so forth to get those technologies into certain countries. But we can develop better senses of how we can move technologies around the world in smarter ways now than we could have 50 or 60 years ago. So I think we can get much more intelligent about moving those technologies around. And if we see that yawning gap between the sort of R&D and scientific haves and the have-nots, we're going to have to do something along those lines to actually get those technologies into the parts of the world that really need them. So.
I'm a little bit less optimistic on the technology movement than Phil is, mainly because I worry that when you look at tropical agriculture, the research stock for addressing tropical agriculture is very limited, even in places like here. And so a lot of the benefit we've had in the Green Revolution was that we took research stock from temperate zone agriculture and adapted it to tropical conditions. But there's no research stock on cassava that we can build on. And that's the big problem, and that's the stickiness on technology that I worry about. There's a lot more interest now in African agriculture and doing something about Africa. And there's a lot of R&D work that's being invested in, quite a lot of that also coming from the Gates Foundation's own grant making in this area. But it's going to take a long time before you'll see fruits of that investments coming through. On the policy side, I think there are two different types of issues here. One is there are certain policies that can kick in and off, and they move relatively fast with price changes, etc. So if you look at what's been happening after 2007, agriculture is really back on the agenda in a fairly big way, and you do see significant investments in agriculture that are taking place, much more on the production side and supply side. If you look even at Africa, there's over a dozen countries now that are investing more than 10% of their budget in agriculture, etc. So that kind of a policy response has moved fast. And the second policy response that's moved fast is on the trade side. If you take my own country, India, after 2007, they suddenly said, we're going to ban all rice and wheat exports. And I just came back from India 2 weeks ago, and they've got 66 million tons of food stocks sitting there today. And the big question for them is, what are we going to do with that? And so I can imagine there'll be some change coming about in their trade policy in order to just manage that. So on those fronts, you do see policy responses taking place fairly quickly. But then the stickiness comes when you've got real political economy problems. So subsidies is one area where the benefits to certain groups of farmers is so huge that they're not going to let that go easily. We know that from many places, including here. So.
I'd just like to push back a little bit on the technology transfer, because we tend to think about it coming from the U.S. or these advanced countries, but it's really the China, Brazil, those emerging economies that have the technologies in stock. And when I think about cassava, Brazil has invested a lot in cassava, and it is moving into Africa. And so I do want to push back a little bit on our orientation. Should we be looking at north to south or south to south at this point?
Yeah, and some of that's happening. And Brazil is doing quite a bit in Africa in terms of cassava, but it's still in very early stages. There's a long way to go. And so there's a lot of investment that needs to take place.
Adriel?
Adriela Fernandez, visiting the Latin American Studies Center at Stanford from Purdue. Thank you very much for two very evocative presentations. I have a question, but it's more of trying to connect the first presentation mentioned repeatedly that the first Green Revolution was basically a public space. It was public sector led, meaning governments and international organizations representing government came together to facilitate it. And that was the case. On the other hand, we have these trends, like in productivity or the R&D to really find out what is it that we need to do, going away from what we consider basics and perhaps some other people don't. I'm with Rose in that when she mentioned that perhaps we are focusing too much in one or two areas of the world, because the two cases that I have been working the most lately, Chile and Brazil, are, especially Chile, is a counterexample of how slow or how sticky things can be, in the sense that there was a net importer of food 30 years ago. Today is about the 14th food exporter. I mean, something happened in the last 25 years, and it happened fast. Chile doesn't have much land, by the way, or water. So it's an interest. There are very interesting cases in which the situation is being turned around, and even not necessarily on their specific more portfolio of exports per se, but the unconventional way in which they had been working in the last 20 years. Chile is the #1 supplier of seed for the United States, for instance. And but my point is that in Brazil, it's true that they have a long way to go. On the other hand, they too have turned around things from putting some infrastructure together in the 60s and a social architecture to manage agricultural production, among other things, to Cerrado today. There has been a continuous, despite poor governance at some point. And when better governance came, you see what is happening in Brazil. I guess what I'm going is, we do need to include, it's not just, policy is not done in an abstract. Policy is done by people that understand a country, understand what it needs, understand a region. We need to get our best and brightest thinking in those terms, as opposed to speculation in the market, in the financial markets, for instance. So anyway, that was, my point is on the relevance of getting good national and regional information and people talking, sharing.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's a great set of comments. I don't know if either of you want to respond or whether we should go to the next question, or it's a.
I mean, there's a lot already happening now, which goes along the lines that you've talked about. There's a lot more regional discussion and regional integration taking place on the policy side in Africa. much of the discussion in Africa today, through the African Union, etc., the NEPAD work, the CADEP initiative, etc., is bringing together some kind of a coherence in the African region. There's a lot more discussion south-south between China, Brazil, and Africa today than there was even 5 years ago. These are things that we're beginning to see, and maybe over the next 10 years you'll see a big difference, but it's something to watch.
I think we're almost out of time, right? The reception is about to start, but let's take one more question. Was there a question in the back there?
Susan Young, just from the community, but I've been doing some work in Africa, but I've been hearing about some economic work that's been going on at country level to introduce the economic value of natural resources into the equations of countries. And I'm wondering if you guys see that influencing anything in agriculture policy or R&D when you start to see more economic valuation on natural resources, water, whatever.
Prabhu was a participant in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and I know had a number of these conversations. So do you want to start, Prabhu?
Yeah, I just came back from a meeting in New York, actually, where we brought a group of people together to talk about exactly how do you put in place metrics to measure different environmental services and look at the trade-offs between productivity improvement and some of the environmental costs associated with that. So it's very much along those lines. I don't think we've got the metrics in a place where policymakers can say, let's invest here and not there. I think eventually that's where we should go. I think there's a lot of conceptual understanding, and with the whole issue of carbon credits, there's a lot more appreciation for valuation, but we don't have in place those metrics. So that's where we are now moving forward, and there's a global effort that's getting off the ground now to try and get better at it.
Bill, anything?
No, just to second what Prabhu said, that, I mean, whether it leads to policy change, I think there is a lot of hard work going on by many people at different levels, both in countries we collaborate with in sub-Saharan Africa and amongst ourselves and other colleagues, in terms of trying to get a better handle, at least on these natural inputs into agriculture, and at least at a quantitative, if not a valuation perspective, understand their role in terms of how they're limiting productivity performance, not only over time, but across locations. So there's huge spatial variation in terms of productivity performance that we see in the analyses we do, which open up lots of prospects for thinking much more intelligently about where to locate agriculture, and not from a sort of a planning perspective, but just to look at the sorts of natural assets that you've got and to provide that information for the market, be they smallholder farmers, but policymakers and other intermediaries to respond to. So, you know, one example is, you know, if there's a persistent call for reinvigorating the African agricultural soils and using fertilizers and so forth, and what types of fertilizers where is a specific question. So I think we're now at the point where we can start to go beyond calls for the need for more of that, to think about how intelligently you might deploy, which is still very limited resources, and do you sprinkle fertiliser randomly throughout the East African landscape, or are we better off targeting it to some areas versus others? And if we do, what are the likely sort of runoff implications and things like that that might have externality effects? So you know, as Prabhu said, we're not there to run this stuff right now, but we are in some cases, but not generally. But I think there's a clear movement in that direction, which I think can only be good.
And there's also, I think, some unexpected consequences of some of this. I don't know if you read recently the bid to get more carbon credits on land caused some companies to come in and force villagers out to grow crops that would sequester more carbon. And so I actually think valuing this is a really good thing. These kinds of unintended consequences were somewhat of a surprise, and I'm sure could happen in any kind of a cash crop. So that will come along with it. Anyway, it's been a great conversation, and I urge you to stay for the reception and ask more questions of both of our speakers in the reception. I know it's getting late, and I want you to have a chance to drink and talk and discuss more of these issues. Thank you for coming.